This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Today we are going to unbox a sealed mint-in-box Warhammer paint set from the far-off year of 1998 to see if we can get these old dried-out paints to still work, and if we can use them to paint the retro Lizardman models inside. The first step was to take the plastic off this box, and it really pained me to do this, but it had to be done. The Howl Corp Patreon demanded it of me, and who am I to say no to them? Underneath the plastic, I was really surprised to see just how mint condition this box was. This box really did feel like I had bought it at the store today, and I'll have to find a nice place to display it in my studio. Inside the box, we are greeted with this beautiful Citadel color painting guide, just a massive hit of nostalgia to start off this box. And below this, we have the time capsule that is the rest of this paint set, consisting of 2 brushes, 1 sable and 1 synthetic, 9 brand new paints, and 5 Lizardmen models still on the sprue. But as I suspected, these paints are totally dried out. It looks like this box was stored on its side for many years, and all the paints have solidified to one side of the pot. This is definitely a bit of a shame, but ultimately not surprising. So over the course of this week, I did my best to reconstitute these paints so I could actually use them. And here was the approach that I took. I started out by adding just a little bit of water to one of the paint pots and tried breaking down the solid mass of the paint with a wooden stir stick. It was pretty stubborn, but I just kept on working it, and I had the idea to add just a little bit of glaze medium into the mix, as glaze medium is useful both as a paint medium, but also contains drying retarder, which I thought might help break things down a little bit, and this seemed to work pretty well. I pretty quickly switched from a wooden stir stick to a metal sculpting tool with a sharp edge on it, and continued to work the solid mass of the paint mixture, breaking it down more and slowly adding more and more glaze medium and water as I went. After waiting a few hours, I could tell this was definitely working, and while the resulting paints might end up a little bit more like a glaze than a thick opaque paint, I'm not really mad about that, as it's pretty in line with my paint style anyway. Once I could see that this process was working, I used the same basic process for each paint, breaking down the paint with a sculpting tool, adding glaze medium and water, setting it aside for a few hours to soak, and then repeating the process a few hours later. I continued doing this for a few days, and it was a very tedious process, returning to each of the paints once or twice a day to continue breaking down the hard parts, adding more water and medium as I went. However, eventually I started to notice the paints were looking a little bit too thin. Maybe I added just a little bit too much water and glaze medium, so I tried adding some golden fluid matte medium, which is a little bit of a thicker paint medium that I had on hand, to the mixture in the hope that it would bulk up the paint a little bit and make it a little bit thicker. As I was continuing to mash up the paints, I also assembled the 5 Lizardmen that came in the box, and while the sprues were quite dated and simple, I was rather surprised at the level of modularity packed into this simple kit. Even with just 2 sprues, having all of the parts interchangeable allowed me to make each Lizardman look a little bit unique, even within these limitations. I based them with sand, gave them a black prime, followed this up by an overspray in white, and after this, it's time to start painting. But before we do that, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about this video's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is the all-in-one learning platform where you can teach yourself all kinds of stuff. From painting to cooking to web design, I think Skillshare is a really good option if you want to teach yourself new skills, to broaden your career, personal life, or skills as an artist. Personally, I've been taking Ali Abdal's masterclass on learning Notion for productivity and organization, and I am just having a ton of fun with it. After completing this course, I would say that Notion is my go-to app for keeping everything in my life organized, from my miniatures backlog to my D&D campaign, and just daily life tasks that I need to keep on top of. So if you'd like to learn Notion or any number of other skills today, why not check out Skillshare? Right now, they are offering a free 1-month free trial to the first 1,000 people to click the link down in the description. So go down there, click that link, and have yourself a Skillshare today. I started painting the Lizardmen about 5 days after I started the paint reconstitution process, and at this point the paints were still a little bit globby, but still liquid enough that I thought I could paint with them. I decided to start by applying some shadows using Bestial Brown, and here you can see the final results of trying to bring these 25-year-old paints back to life. The paints kind of work, but in reality, there's still a lot of little particles in the paint that you have to try and brush away as you apply the color. These paints honestly do look pretty bad if you try to use them to get full coverage. There's no real opacity here. So instead of doing that, I tried my best to use these paints as glazes to gradually build up thin layers of color on top of the model. I applied some sunburst yellow on top of the brown to try and build up some non-metallic gold onto the areas of the shield and the weapons, and I also added some yellow glazing to parts of the skin for a reason I'll explain in just a moment. Overall, I found that the yellow and the black were the two hardest paints to bring back to life. They were really hard to break down, and you can see here I tried my best to remove any excess particles, but a few still made their way onto the model. I painted the skin using Enchanted Blue, which I felt was one of the better paints that I was able to bring back to life. And you can see that the reason I applied the yellow to some parts of the skin here was to mix with the blue in some places to give the skin a little bit more of a turquoise look. If you couldn't tell, I'm trying to match the colors more or less from the box arts. For the scales on the lizardmen's back, I wanted a sort of violet color, so I applied some blood red on top of the still drying blue color and got something close to what I was looking for. I also used a little bit of red to add some shading to the non-metallic gold parts on the model, and after this, I rimmed the base in goblin green and painted the shield icon in this color as well. And once this was done, I tried using some of my thinned down black color to try and add some shadows to the figure. So hands down, Chaos Black was the hardest paint to bring back to life. The best I could do was sort of coax a black wash out of it, which honestly serves our purpose here pretty well today. I used this color like a black wash to try and add some shadows to the model, and at the same time I also used some skull white, which was actually surprisingly one of the easier colors to bring back to life. I think it actually worked pretty well to paint on any extra highlights that I wanted. Because we're using a glazing approach, I exaggerated the highlights slightly and then went back in with all of the base colors and added more color glazes on top of those highlights to up the saturation and blend everything together. I did a few rounds of this, adding more highlights, adding more color glazes, and trying my best not to get too many of the little paint particles on the model. And honestly, I think the results are not that bad, considering we're basically using crushed up plastic mixed with water and some medium to try and make our own paints. Basically, I added a little bit of green flock to the bases at the end to really add that retro look. Dry brushed the flock in goblin green and then sunburst yellow to add a bit of vibrancy, and that's pretty much it. Overall, I would not recommend that you buy a 25-year-old paint set from eBay to try and paint some retro models. But to be fair, I actually did have quite a bit of fun trying to bring these things back to life and paint these old models. And if you're wondering why I did this in the first place, this is actually the sequel to a previous video where I opened up a Games Workshop time capsule that I found on eBay. You can check out that video right here to see the full contents of that time capsule. And after we opened it, I let my patrons decide what to do with all the contents of the box. The highest number of votes was to open and test out the paint set, so that's exactly what we did. And if you want to be part of the next round of voting and check out our patron-only Discord server, you can also check out the link right here to do that as well. But I have to confess, I did cheat just a little bit, because there were actually a surprising amount of people in the comments section of the previous video begging me to keep it all sealed, as it might actually be the only example of this that's fully complete that still exists from the 90s. So to respect the wishes of those people who wanted me to keep that box as a historical monument, I actually went on eBay and bought a second copy of this paint set so that we could keep the original one sealed with the rest of that stuff. And to be honest, I'll probably try and do the same thing with whatever the patrons choose for me to unbox and paint next, as I think there is something to the idea of keeping it all sealed for future hobbyists. Anyway, I've gone on long enough, so thank you to everyone for watching this video. Thank you, as always, to all of my lovely patrons for keeping this channel going, and I'll see you in the next video.